In this video I wanted to review, react to, look at an article that came out about a year ago in Quillette called The Hard Problems of Vegetarianism by Daniel Ising. I'm not going to read the whole article, I'm just going to sort of highlight bits that I had thoughts on, but if anyone wants to read the whole article, I'll put the link in the description. My initial expectations of the article before I'd read it, when I just seen the title, were not high, just because it was addressing vegetarianism, which is not, shall we say, the most watertight ethical lifestyle, belief, philosophy, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, let's delve into the article, see what's actually in it, and see if there are any actual credible points made against the moral consideration of animals and, by extension, their non-exploitation. Even so, I will argue that the moral high ground often claimed by animal advocates, for whom the issues at hand are so obvious that they struggle to understand how anyone in their right mind could possibly disagree, is shakier than the movement would like to admit. Honestly addressing these shortcomings, I believe, would lend more credibility to the cause among sympathetic but not quite convinced onlookers, and make it hard to reject its central message outright because of some supposedly unaddressed internal contradiction. So I agree with him here. I don't think as an animal rights movement we should be over-claiming on anything. The case is so clear and so obvious that we kind of have it on our side anyway without having to over-claim. And I think if we do over-claim and say things that actually aren't quite true, it could afford people that disagree with us more of a reason to walk away without actually having to take the real case seriously. And obviously I think we should avoid that, but when someone like Daniel does say that there's an internal contradiction or there's somewhat of an overclaim, we kind of have to ask, well, what are those? So anyway, let's go on and see what he thinks the overclaiming is. It's tempting to put this in the context of the inevitable, if often bumpy, march of progress. Just like our views on homosexuality have gradually transformed, moving its status from criminal offence to mental disorder to accepted behaviour, it took time for humanity to become enlightened about the cause of animal welfare. Singer, meaning Peter Singer, calls this the expanding circle, which encompasses an ever wider range of beings and deeds. The danger of such a view is that it makes our own day and age more exceptional than they most likely are, which is of course an all too human attitude towards things. It makes you susceptible to believe that our era represents a kind of logical endpoint in our species' moral development. Incidentally, previously generations shared this conviction. I don't see how he sees the expanding circle as implying for every generation that we've sort of reached the logical endpoint of ethics. My understanding of the expanding circle is that it's the complete opposite. It challenges the status quo of ethics at the time and makes us think, well, how actually should we or can we expand this circle anymore and think outside the box to who is being morally considered at the moment and who isn't. I think Daniel's just got the complete wrong end of the stick on this one and what the expanding circle is actually meant to mean. Scale and mechanization of the slaughtering process have made the killing psychologically more bearable for both slaughterhouse employees and consumers. Would the latter still be eating meat if they had to get their own hands dirty at least once? If you're inclined to say no, should we then not encourage things like hunting as a way to create a more meaningful, responsible relationship with the creatures that end up on our plate? So I think what Daniel is doing here is trying to propose hunting as an alternative that will make us reduce the amount of animals that we kill because we're more aware of what goes on. But also maybe he's suggesting, even though he doesn't actually mention them, that it will be better for the animals as well. The main point that I would disagree with him on here is that if he's saying that killing an animal yourself is going to stop you from eating animals, if you know that actually physically going and killing an animal yourself is going to make you more aware of the moral crime that you're committing and then hence stop you doing it, why do it in the first place? You don't need to go out and do some sort of blood sacrifice so that you can become like ethically awakened. Just use your brain, like that's what you've got it for. Use your brain, think about it, think about others. Don't just think of it from your point of view like, oh yeah, I'm going to go and I'm going to kill someone else and therefore I'm going to benefit from that because I'm going to become more enlightened. No, reason through it, think about the others that are being impacted by your actions, and don't go out into a forest and gun someone else down. Maybe this will be dismissed as a rather silly and far-fetched point, and that may well be the case. It does, however, point towards some thorny issues to which moral purism is poorly suited. The historical observation that moral progress is not solely a function of changing convictions, but also of changing material conditions that make conforming to these convictions less costly remains underappreciated. Taking it seriously may require presenting meat eaters with alternatives that are imperfect for a strictly vegetarian point of view, but stand a better chance of reducing animal suffering overall. Moral purism can be counterproductive, and it can cause the average person to push someone away who is just trying to get them to consider the ethical implications of their actions. I think it would be okay if someone wanted to push someone away because they were being annoying, but still actually themselves ethically consider what they're doing. But it's too often the case that someone will push away an animal rights activist and then just forget about the subject overall and not consider actually what their actions are doing. Then he goes on to talk about how actually moral progress is not always driven by people having this sort of ethical awakening, but it's actually just changing people's behaviors or making it easier for people to do the more ethical thing without them really having to change their views on the matter. I actually agree with Daniel here. It's not that I don't want people to have an, ethical awakening about animal rights and stuff like that. It's just, in reality, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think people are going to have this ethical awakening en masse over time. I think what's going to happen is animal exploitation is going to be made redundant by technological innovations like lab-grown meat. Our understanding of animals' mental capacities has advanced tremendously since the days of Descartes' soulless machines. However, decades of research have not brought us much closer to a subjective understanding of what is going on inside the head of a pig, a cow, or a dog. As Thomas Nagel famously argued, while we can understand how bats use echolocation to navigate, we do not understand what it is like to be a bat. We can, albeit with some difficulty, put ourselves in someone else's shoes, but not in a horse's hooves, so to speak. Absent the experience of an animal's qualia, we rely on somewhat crude behavioral observations to judge how our actions affect them. Pain and pleasure, joy and sadness are at least in principle observable, and they are typically used to justify who does and doesn't count as a moral patient. This point, often in my experience, kind of gets over-egged. Yes, of course, we are different in significant ways, but I think if we were going to do anything at all, we should err on the side of affording them more moral consideration than we should do, rather than less moral consideration. But I feel like this whole point of you can't put yourself in their shoes, you're humanizing, all stuff like this, often it's over-exaggerated so that people can essentially other non-human animals and feel more comfortable in disregarding them morally. I would say it's generally better not to kill and eat someone and then find out it would have been okay to do so, than to kill and eat someone and then find out that actually you've done a really horrible thing. Now, if some form of utilitarianism underlies all animal welfare theories, the notion that animals' interests need to be taken into account can be challenged by denying that the utilitarian calculus can be meaningfully applied across species. All it takes is to argue that we are not only quantitatively but also qualitatively different from non-human animals. Both human and non-human animals suffer pain, yet presumably only humans are able to anticipate it, reflect upon it, and live their lives in dread of it. Well, you can presume that if you want, but it's obviously a wrong assumption. There are loads of examples of animals knowing that they're going to come into harm's way and trying to avoid it. You can psychologically abuse and torture human beings, but you wouldn't be able to achieve the same results with animals. Anyone who has a companion animal like a cat or a dog can attest to the fact that even without laying a hand on that animal, you can psychologically torture and abuse them. Obviously, harming others beyond laying a physical hand on them extends beyond the human species. The typical rejoinder points to what came to be known as marginal cases. There are humans whose mental capacities are extremely impaired for one reason or another, yet we empathetically refuse to treat them the way we treat cattle, pigs, or chickens. Nor should we. Saying that animals deserve to be treated better than we currently do does not imply that we should treat humans worse. The problem with the argument from marginal cases is a different one. Firstly, while it is true that some humans lack the full conscious experience to which an ordinary member of the species has access, it is also true that there is no super feline cat whose cognitive capacities are way above the typical repertoire. The situation is not symmetrical. So what he's saying here is that the argument from marginal cases, which is essentially the argument that says if we identify something in an animal, that means we can exploit them. If we identify the same thing in a human, which we almost always can, say they're of lower intelligence, it means we can exploit the human as well. But what Daniel is saying is that we can't actually use the marginal cases argument, because even though there are cases in the human species of individuals that have the same qualities as other animals, for example, the same intelligence as an animal, if we discriminate against those humans that have the same quality as other animals, it will collectively impact humans as a whole. Whereas in the case of other animals, Daniel uses the example of a cat, discriminating against them won't have the same effect, because actually none of the animals have the psychological capability to understand that they're being discriminated against. What Daniel fails to see, though, is that he's essentially misunderstanding the foundation of the marginal cases argument. He's correct in saying that we're comparing apples with oranges when we compare a chicken population with a human population, because yes, most humans do have a far higher cognitive capacity than any chicken, and instead of comparing apples to apples, Daniel just dismisses his apples to oranges analysis and then just moves on. But if we compared apples to apples, for example, if we took the marginal case in the human example, saying someone who had the intelligence of a chicken, but then matched the human example with the chicken example so that all of the humans have the intelligence of a chicken, then would we still be justified in treating the humans in the way that we treat chickens, i.e. farming them, exploiting them, killing them? I think, put to him, Daniel would then reject that, because I don't think Daniel is going to bite the bullet on killing millions, if not billions, of severely mentally disabled people. Secondly, humans with severe brain damage will generally still be interwoven into the fabric of society, and other people will have a personal stake in their well-being, just like they have a stake in the well-being of their pet. Whether or not this justifies vastly different treatment is a tough question, but we have a strong inclination to treat human beings as ends in themselves. So yeah, I would go further and say that even if there was someone who was severely mentally impaired and they didn't have any sort of ties to any other person who was of a normal cognitive capacity, I would still say, and I think Daniel would agree, that we should not be treating them as we currently treat chickens. And then he rounds off there by saying that we have a strong inclination to treat humans as an ends in themselves. Yes, I agree, that's how we should view humans, but then I would also say that's how we should view other animals as well. Is the individual animal the proper object of our concern, or should the preservation of a species trump those interests in cases where the two conflict? Suffering certainly takes place at the individual level, but we have already seen that this concept is fraught with difficulties, and there is the fundamental evolutionary reality that in the struggle for the survival of the fittest, the well-being of any individual member is secondary to the expansion of a species' ecological niche, which is how genes maximize the copies they pass on to the next generation. Well, the first thing I'd say is, yeah, obviously we should take into account the individual, not the species. A species is not a thing. It is a label that humans have made up to give to groups of individuals. When we think morally and ethically, we need to think of the individual. A species can't suffer. A species has no interests. An individual, as Daniel admits, suffers and has interests. Those should be the object of our ethical concern. He also says that when thinking ethically, taking the individual into account is fraught with difficulties. He doesn't actually go into what these difficulties are. He just kind of says that vaguely and moves on. So I'm just kind of, going to disregard that point. He also says that there is just the fundamental evolutionary fact that survival of the fittest takes place on the species level, not the individual level. It does also occur on the individual level, but I get his point. I would just say, why should we care what precedent is set by evolution? Should we base our ethical principles on it? I would say no. It's been a great deal so far. There are 650 million pigs alive today, down from an 800 million high in 2013, compared to around 1,000 ferocious mountain gorillas or around 4,000 vicious tigers that remain in the wild. This is why you shouldn't think of ethics at the species level and you should at the individual level. There are, how many was it? 650 million pigs, the vast majority in slaughterhouses and factory farms, being tortured every second of their life and then having their lives ended with a knife in their throat. And this guy has the audacity to say that they're getting a good deal. By giving away their meat, skin and milk, farm animals have traded liberty for security with stunning reproductive success. So they haven't given away their meat or whatever, we've taken it from them. And when he says they've traded it, they didn't trade it, they were guided by a process of evolution to become domesticated by humans. Again, this is the problem with viewing it at the species level. If you view it at the species level, yeah, you can see it as a species trading its liberty for reproductive success, but no individual in that process consciously made that decision, and many of them get a really bad deal. They don't get looked after, and they get killed and their body taken away from them. Few, if any, of these domesticated species could ever survive in the wild for lack of foraging abilities or because their very tameness makes them easy prey. Here he's kind of implying that the domestication of animals is justified because we have increased their survivability, or if that is a word, because otherwise in the wild they'd have a really hard time surviving. But this species doesn't need to exist. We're just breeding individuals into existence to then force a domesticated life onto them when they never asked for it. They don't need it. These individuals don't need to exist. We're just breeding them into existence, and then we're saying, oh, well, you know, we're so holy because those other animals in nature have a hard life. For all of the horrors of factory farming, being torn to pieces by a pack of wolves is not exactly a peaceful death either, not to mention succumbing to droughts, floods, and pest-induced famines. Yes, dying by being stabbed in the throat may be slightly better than being eaten alive by wolves, but the animal that got stabbed in the throat didn't need to exist. You're literally creating someone by breeding them using someone else's body, stabbing them in the throat, and then pointing to a wolf in nature and saying, well, he's doing something worse, so therefore what I'm doing is justified, or at least I can muse on it. For communist luminaries, the utopian society was one in which the very concept of class had withered away. Like most of its predecessors, this version of utopianism suffered from a lack of dynamism. It was static in the sense that any deviation from pursuit of the perfect arrangement would by definition lead to a less than perfect and thus less desirable state of affairs. Once utopia had been established, the cause on which it was built would lose its significance. What is the point of religion in heaven, or a seizing of the means of production once private property had been abolished? Unsurprisingly then, we now use the word utopian almost synonymously with unrealistic, detached from reality, or just plain crazy. Nevertheless, a committed animal advocate ought to be asked what kind of utopia they have in mind when advocating for their cause. He's raised this term utopia, discredited it, but then applied it to animal advocates without us actually necessarily using it or adopting it. So I just wanted to point out that sort of underhand straw man that he's trying to apply to others. Like, no one's claiming we're going to have some sort of utopia where the lion will walk with the lamb or something like that. These are imaginary things that are not going to happen. What animal advocates want to do is try and get to a point where we don't view animals as resources and objects, and structure our societies and behave in ways that respect them as individuals with interests of their own. At what point would our society have advanced so far that any remaining injustices towards animals are either so insignificant that we should spend our time tackling other problems, or so entrenched that we're likely to do more harm than good in trying to solve them? Would hunting still be allowed? Well, I would say no. Why would you kill someone else when you don't have to? And presumably when we get to the point where we've abolished so much of animal use and we're thinking about whether to let hunting remain or not, we've probably got to the point where every human has access to some sort of stable source of non-animal calories. Could we still have pets, and if so, under what conditions? Well, if there are animals to adopt, yeah, but don't breed animals into existence just to keep them as pets. They're not commodities or tinker toys to improve our lives. They're individuals in and of themselves. Would we actively be managing wildlife or let things run their course? But I don't think we should just completely leave animals now as they are. There's a lot of suffering that goes on. I would say that we should try very carefully and in a very considered way to try and address that issue. Could we continue to slaughter and consume animals that had enjoyed a long long and fulfilling life? Could we slaughter and consume humans who had a long and fulfilling life? I would say no. And assuming that animal testing would still not be entirely replaceable by artificial means, should it be illegal? I understand that there is some nuance there, but it can't be done in all this video. But I would say as a general rule of thumb, I would say, it's not our body to use, so we should not be using it. Generally, I didn't really think this article was up to much. I think there was some major confusion going on with ethics and whether we should concern the individual or the species. But I kind of had red flags about the article straight from the off, just because the person who was writing it was a vegetarian, and so maybe even arrogantly kind of assumed that their ethical reasoning on this subject wasn't going to be too amazing. But anyway, let me know if you came across this article as well, and let me know what you thought down below.